Last week, we saw Kyren Williams, Josh Allen, Bijan Robinson, Mike Evans, Rashee Rice, and Nico Collins go off in fantasy football and help people win their matchups. Well, in today's video, I am bringing you 10 names that will do the same, that will absolutely dominate in week 10 of the fantasy football season. There are so many buys this week, so it's slim pickings, but don't worry. If you got some players in today's video, you have a very good shot to win. The first player that I believe is going to dominate, that is Jaylen Warren versus the Arizona Cardinals. He's been on a heater lately, and I think that continues, but I don't think people realize how good he's actually been since his bye week. From week 7 onwards, in that span, he is third in rushing yards amongst running backs. He has the third best yards per attempt at 7.1 yards per attempt. He is tied for 12th in rushing touchdowns. And in fantasy points, he is the RB12 in that time span. This is when we look at a minimum of 10 carries. Jaylen Warren, in that span, has more points per game, guys, than Isaiah Pacheco, Derrick Henry, DeAndre Swift, Bijan Robinson, Colonel Raheem Mostert, Tony Pollard, and Ken Walker. He has been on a tear, and now he gets to play the Arizona Cardinals, who in 2023, this is an incredible matchup. They give up the third most rushing yards per game at 140, the 7th highest yards per rush allowed at 4.5, the second most offensive points allowed per game, almost 27 allowed a game, and more importantly, the second most fantasy points to the running back position at 31 PPR points per game. Start Jaylen Warren with a ton of confidence this week. Again, we're talking about players that are going to dominate. Brandon Ayuk at the Philadelphia Eagles. He's had a great year so far. He's the wide receiver 16 on the year. Now, he missed a game in week 3, but if we look at week 4 onwards, let's look at that span. Since week 4, he is 7th in receiving yards. Think about how many good receivers in today's NFL. My guy is 7th in receiving yards, 709 in that span. His yards per reception are second with 20.9 yards per reception when we look at 20 target minimum. If you look at receptions over 20 yards, he is second. Only Tyreek Hill has more of those receptions, more of those downfield explosive receptions. And amongst wide receivers, he is the wide receiver 10 in that span in a PPR format. He has been so good, guys. He has more points per game in that span than Adam Thielen, Michael Pittman, Puka Nacua, Jalen Waddle, Devonta Smith, Jordan Addison, Garrett Wilson, and Chris Olave. And his hot streak should continue this week versus the Philadelphia Eagles. I'm excited to see these two teams who they don't like each other. I'm excited to watch this game. I think Ayuk's going to be a very big part of it. And the matchup is great. The Eagles in 2023 allow the 4th most passing yards per game. You can throw on these guys. It's not that easy to run. You typically attack them in the air, but you can throw on them. The 13th most offensive points allowed per game, almost 22.5 points allowed per game by the Eagles defense. And more importantly, they give up the second most fantasy points per game to wide receivers. Over 43 PPR points per game the Eagles are allowing right now, which is absolutely bonkers. So start Ayuk with a ton of confidence. All right, the third player here. This brings me to my spicy, bold, hot take of the week. Last week on this show, we told you guys that Kyren Williams was going to come back strong. Now, we said he would score over 17 PPR points. He pretty much doubled that, if not more. I didn't expect him to score 3 touchdowns, but I did expect him to have an incredible game back from injury. Now, in week 13, our hot take of the week is that Tua Tagovailoa will throw 3 passing touchdowns and finish as a top 5 fantasy quarterback against the Washington Commanders. Look, Tua has had a difficult 3-game stretch. He really has for fantasy football. In his last 3 games, you might not believe me, but this is true. Go look it up. In his last 3 games, Tommy DeVito is scoring more fantasy points. Baker Mayfield is scoring more fantasy points per game, if you can actually believe that. Tua is scoring just 13.6 points per game in that span. He needs a bounce back matchup. And the good news is this is exactly what you get in the Washington Commanders. In 2023, the Commanders allowed the third most passing yards per game, almost 270 per game, and the most offensive points per game allowed, almost 30 points per game this defense is allowing. Ridiculous. They also allowed the most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position at 23 points per game. Guys, there's not another defense allowing over 20 points per game to quarterbacks. This could be an incredible day for Tua. I'm projecting it to be a top 5 finish. Tua has had 2 games so far, over 30 fantasy points this year. When you look at a 6-point passing touchdown league, I believe this could be his third. All right, the fourth player that is going to dominate, that is Ramondre Stevenson versus the Los Angeles Chargers. Stevenson in the first 5 weeks, it was pretty rough. It wasn't very good for fantasy football. That might have left a bad taste in some people's mouths. In that time span, in the first 5 weeks, he was the RB27, but he was only averaging about 9 points per game. It was disappointing. The matchups he had were not good, though. He faced the Eagles, Jets, Cowboys, Saints. Since week 6, though, he has really picked it up. In that time span, he is 12th in rushing yards. He has the 7th best yards per attempt. He is 7th in targets amongst running backs, and he is the RB10 overall in that span. And now he gets to play the Chargers, who, think about this with me for a second. The Chargers don't give a lot of rushing yards per game, but they get smoked through the air. No one gives up more passing yards per game than the Chargers. And I'm thinking about this game. Pop Douglas currently dealing with a concussion. We don't know if he plays. Kendrick Bourne's on IR. Juju is Juju. And there is really no one on this team that they can throw the ball to. I see Ramondre having a huge game through the air. The Chargers allow the 9th most points per game to opposing offenses and the 7th most fantasy points per game to running backs, almost 25 PPR points per game. All right, so like we mentioned, there's a lot of bye weeks this week. I wanted to bring a player that's kind of on the edge for some people, and I wanted to give you a lot of confidence to go ahead and start him with some confidence this week. That is Josh Downs at the Tennessee Titans. In his last 3 games, it's been kind of disappointing for Josh Downs. That's just the truth. In weeks 9 to 10, he was dealing with an injury, and he didn't play a high percentage of snaps. Last week, he was back, but he scored under 10 PPR points. The good news, though, is that he saw 13 targets. He saw 13 targets last week. That's just a ridiculous number. And now that he is fully healthy, I anticipate him having a much better game in week 13 versus the Titans, who allow the 14th most passing yards per game, and more importantly, the 10th most fantasy points per game, over 37 PPR points per game. This secondary is average at best. Keep in mind, guys, Josh Downs has already played the Titans this year with Gardner Minshew as his quarterback. In that game earlier this year, he had 97 receiving yards and finished with just under 16 PPR points. Both Downs and Pittman, I believe that they're going to be very good plays this week. All right, are you looking for a tight end? It's tough out there, but I believe David Njoku is going to have a great game versus the Rams. Njoku last week, I don't know if you guys watched the games, I'm assuming you did. Then you would know that he was this close to being the tight end 1 on the week. I mean, he was prepared to have a massive day in fantasy football. The issue is he had some silly drops. He dropped a touchdown. However, the good news is that he has been really consistent for fantasy, scoring over 10 PPR points in 6 straight games. And that's because he's become a crucial part of this offense. They can't rely on Elijah Moore, sent away Donovan Peoples-Jones. David Njoku has really stepped up to be that number 2 in this offense, and it's helping him for fantasy. Let's look at David Njoku since week 7. He is 2nd in targets amongst tight ends. He is 5th in receptions, 6th in receiving yards, and he is the tight end 6 in that span for fantasy football. And now he has an incredible opportunity ahead of him. The Rams defense is actually good. It's good against the pass. It's good against the run. The one area that you can really exploit this team is through your tight end. They do not guard tight ends well. No one gives up more fantasy points per game to the tight end position. David Njoku could have a big, big week this week. All right, at number 7, how about it? Devin Singletary versus the Denver Broncos. Hey, big shout out to everybody out there who watched my stash videos a couple weeks ago. We were saying stash Devin Singletary. This trend was starting to kind of take over. And even with Dameon Pierce back last week, Devin Singletary still dominated this backfield. And I believe he has completely taken over. If you look at snaps, Devin had 49 snaps to Dameon's 11. If you look at routes run, Devin had 35 to Dameon's 6, 7 targets to Dameon's 1, and he still out-carried Dameon as well. And if you look at the way they deployed these running backs, Devin Singletary was the early down guy. He was the goal line back. He was the short yardage back, the third down back, and he was the guy in the 2-minute drill, taking 18 of 19 total snaps in those scenarios. He's their dude. They've made that obvious. And now he gets to play the Denver Broncos, who, let's be honest, they have gotten better, but they have gotten better through the air. They are still one of the worst rushing defenses in the NFL. In 2023, the Broncos allowed the most rushing yards per game, the highest yards per rush to opposing running backs, the 4th most points per game to opposing offenses, and the most points per game to fantasy running backs, even when you adjust for schedule. They're allowing over 31 PPR points per game. I'll tell you what, Devin Singletary, if you picked him up, you may have landed yourself a league winner, or at least someone that is going to get you to the playoffs with matchups like this. All right, the 8th player. Look, he and his quarterback have not been on the same page, but I believe they get on the same page this week. That is Hollywood Brown at the Pittsburgh Steelers. Hollywood and Kyler, like I said, they just haven't, there's not been this mind meld yet, right? You know in Avatar when the characters kind of connect their tails? Yeah, that's weird. But that hasn't happened yet for Kyler and Hollywood. But the good news is we have seen this duo put up some ridiculous numbers, both in college and on the Cardinals last year before Hollywood got injured. And last week, Hollywood was targeted 12 times versus the Rams. That is the most targets he's had this entire year. I think this is the year that he kind of gets back. This is the week that he gets back on track versus the Steelers, who allow the 9th most passing yards per game and the 11th most fantasy points to wide receivers. All right, at number 9, let's keep riding the hot hand. Rashad White is on a heater. We don't walk away from heaters. We do not walk away from a heater. Rashad White averaging 18.5 PPR points per game in the last 6 matchups. And now he gets to play the Panthers. Rest in peace, Panthers. I mean, we know how bad this team is. They just fired everyone. They give up the 9th most rushing yards per game, the 3rd most overall points per game, and the 6th most points per game to opposing running backs, over 26 PPR points. Nobody's getting volume in this backfield outside of Rashad White. He is set to have a huge, huge day. All right, at number 10, Jaylen Waddle at the Washington Commanders. You remember, we talked earlier about how Tua was going to throw 3 touchdowns. Who's going to be the beneficiary of that? Obviously, Tyreek Hill is going to be a beneficiary, but this will be, in my opinion, a big Jaylen Waddle game. He's a wide receiver 27 on the season. He hasn't really lived up to expectations, but we know with his talent in this offense, there is always an opportunity for him to be a top 5 guy, and this is the right matchup. The Commanders are getting dominated through the air, the 3rd most passing yards per game, the most points to opposing offenses, and for wide receivers specifically, no one gives up more fantasy points per game than the Washington Commanders secondary. So I just laughed because I looked at how many points they're allowing per game. Washington is allowing 45 PPR points per game to opposing wide receivers. It's going to be a big day for Jaylen Waddle, so you can start him with some confidence. But that's it for today, guys. Do us a favor, smash that like button. Let us know what you're dealing with in the comments below, what decisions you have to make. We're not going to be able to answer all of them. We'll try. But of course, if you're writing a comment, maybe scroll through and see if you can help someone else, help the community out. But Good luck, go get a win, and we'll see you very soon. Now that those idiots are done talking, who needs some rankings?
Hell yeah, I need some rankings.
Then use promo code LAND, LAND, for 30% off any membership at flockfantasy.com.
Oh.
It's so easy, even your grandma could scan that QR code right there.